Hey, it's Brian Smith with Reconnaissance, and I'm with the Insurance Office of America as a commercial insurance broker, and I focus a lot on government defense contractors. And because of their international travel, I wanted to get another person's perspective, and that is Margaret O'Brien, and she's the owner and founder of a company called Zentripy. And Zentripy gets involved in helping people that travel overseas, both personally and for their business needs. And in fact, we've done some work together. So introduce yourself, Margaret. It's great to see you again.
Thank you. Hello. It's
Hey.
Margaret O'Brien, and I spent 17 years working for Aetna on the international side. I've been on my own now for about 6 years, focusing on the international medical market. I work with a variety of different types of international people, expatriates, third country nationals, global business travelers, and then people who travel for fun, leisure. That's one of my favorite things to do as well.
And because of that, we were talking about, I called you yesterday and I said, hey, can you help me with this unique situation? And let me frame it up real quick. What it was, or what it is that there's a company that I work with and they're sending some people over to the Ukraine. And so one of the issues that were confronted by the owner of the company was COVID. And they're looking for some insurance. So I immediately picked up the phone and I gave Margaret a call. And over the course of like just a couple of minutes, she sent me an article, and in there it said you gotta start thinking about insurance. So for COVID specifically. So Margaret, can you just kind of sum up for us, what some of these parameters are and what a company can do to be prepared for it?
Sure, certainly. So COVID is what's keeping most of us at home. It's the reason why we're having this conversation in the room. But many of us are starting to think about travel again and leaving home. COVID is still top of mind for many people, and countries are looking at it, and they're looking at their own personal risk of bringing people into country with an exposure for COVID. So some countries are starting to have a requirement that not only must you prove that you are COVID free, providing some sort of documentation that you've had a COVID test within the last 72 hours. Additionally, they want you to have international insurance that specifically states that you have coverage for treatment related to COVID. And that is the big concern.
Is it hard to get? I mean, because when we talked about it, you're like, I can't give you a price right now because I was looking for a price for their proposal. And you came back and you said, no, we actually have to underwrite this. And so what are some of the parameters that, because we talked about it, but what are some of the parameters quickly that you could talk about that they need to expect if somebody's looking for this coverage, if they got people that are planning to go overseas?
It's predominantly age.
And then there was something else?
So with the home country and the host country. So they want to look at where you're coming from and how that country is treating COVID today, and where you're going to, what their resources available to treat an individual should that person be diagnosed once they arrive in country.
Yeah. And a couple things that are interesting there is when you talked about they need to have a COVID test already that had been conducted in 72 hours. And heck, it's hard to even get the results back in that time frame. Then you have to be prepared when you're traveling to be able to deliver that information. That's got to be a hiccup. And then when I looked at the article, because you sent me an article, it really targeted, or it spoke specifically about Caribbean countries,
Correct.
Aruba. And so, yeah. And so it's like, all right, so they're looking for very specific things, or quarantine. So you can either have the test, you go into quarantine for a specific amount of time after a test is administered in that country. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Correct.
And the last thing is, I think you mentioned it before, you may have to buy the insurance that's being offered to you by that host country.
Or they won't allow you in. And that is a key consideration, because you've already arrived in country, you think you've taken care of things, but that country can decide you may not stay without buying this policy, and you're not negotiating a price at that point. And it becomes a big issue if you're an employer. If you're spending the money to send an employee to a country, you want to make sure that that person can work once he or she arrives. The last thing you want is that person to arrive in country and then you find out that that person's under a 14-day quarantine before they can even leave the hotel.
Right. Yeah, because these
So,
companies are not only, in addition to this now being a requirement, there's also issues about obtaining visas because there's
correct,
less staff in these countries, right? The time that they may have to be there and the money that's needed to support in the event they got to do a 14-day quarantine. None of
correct.
these were originally put into thought, I believe, when just even a year ago, obviously, about ancillary expenses that could really add to the cost of the contract. So if somebody wanted to do this, or they want to get information about it, what is the best thing that they can do? It just from an insurance perspective, what do you think are some steps they can take?
There's always Google. Google is a great place to get information, but you have to know the right questions to ask in order to get the answers that you might need. I think it helps to talk to an insurance professional. Brien, you and I have worked together because you do so much work with DBA contractors. I rely on you for that information. I'm focused more on the international medical side of it. It helps to talk to someone who spends time in this market on a regular basis and who's aware of the changes in the marketplace.
Because you're not going to be able to get this from, let's say, Blue Cross Blue Shield or maybe even United Healthcare, correct?
Correct. Most of the carriers have an international side of the business, but they've got different rules. And in some carriers, they'll say we treat all medical conditions, but that country may have a requirement that the policy language must specifically mention COVID. You want to know that in advance.
Right. And if it doesn't mention it, is it automatically included if it's not excluded?
No, I would not make that assumption. I certainly would not make that assumption. If it does not specifically talk about COVID, one of the things we've seen with insurance companies is individuals coming to the US might have assumed, should they come here and contract COVID, they would have coverage. But many of the policies specifically exclude treatment related to COVID. So some of them are changing their language today. Some of them are changing their language today, but it's really important that you know what the policy covers before you leave home.
Do you, and we can wrap this up in a minute, but do you have many, how many carriers are you thinking would actually do this kind of policy?
It's fewer than you might think. As I mentioned, many carriers were excluding it. Some of the policies have changed. I have a specific carrier I work with, Tokyo Marine HCC, that changed their language that policies written after July 15th would treat COVID the same as any other medical condition. But it's a very good question to ask the insurer before you write the policy.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's really good advice. Hey, if people want to get a hold of you, what's the best way?
My email is margaret@zentripyglobal.com. My web address is www.zentripyglobal.com. I'm happy to talk it through with you and help you review what your options are.
Do me a favor,
Brien,
spell Zentripy.
Zentripy, Zentripy.
Perfect.
Think of peaceful travel. There we go. Thank you.
There you go. Hey, listen, thank you so much for giving us this information, and I'm going to share it out there with some people. And hey, stay safe yourself.
Thank you. You too.
All right. Bye-bye.